Your clothes were a secret language in the Middle Ages. A simple wool tunic or a silk gown could whisper your deepest loyalties and your place in the world without you ever saying a word. This was the sophisticated reality of medieval textile codes, a hidden system of communication woven into the very fabric of daily life. In this exploration, you will learn to read the lost messages stitched into every thread, transforming your understanding of history from a list of dates into a vivid tapestry of human experience. We will uncover how the color of a dye could declare a rebellion and how a hidden stitch could save a life. What silent stories do you think are waiting to be unraveled from the clothes of the past? The rhythmic clatter of the loom was the heartbeat of the medieval world. To truly hear the whispers in the fabric, we must first step into that world of creation, a world centered not in grand castles but in crowded, bustling workshops. The air was thick with the pungent smell of dye vats and the earthy scent of raw wool. This was a vast and intricate industry, a chain of labor that stretched from the peasant shearing sheep in a muddy field to the master weaver at his complex frame. Every piece of cloth represented the work of countless hands, each performing a specialized task. Spinners transformed fluffy fleece into strong, consistent thread, a skill so essential it became the very symbol of a woman's work. Weavers then interlaced these threads on looms, their shuttles flying back and forth to create the foundation of the cloth. Only then would the dyers work their alchemy, plunging the plain fabric into bubbling pots to achieve colors that could speak volumes. The materials themselves were the first and most fundamental word in this silent language. Wool was the common tongue, worn by nearly everyone, but its quality ranged from the scratchy, undyed wool of a serf's tunic to the superfine, brilliantly colored wool of a noble's cloak. Linen, spun from the flax plant, was prized for undergarments and summer wear, a mark of practical comfort, but for the elite, silk was the ultimate statement. Imported at great cost and danger along trade routes from the east, silk was more than a fabric, it was liquid wealth. To wear it was to declare your power without uttering a single word. Because the creation of even a simple tunic demanded so much time and skill, clothing was a significant investment, often passed down through generations and carefully itemized in wills. This inherent value meant that the choice of material was never casual. It was the foundation upon which all other messages were built, a basic but powerful code understood by every member of society. But the material was only the first word in this silent conversation. The very structure of the cloth, the way the threads locked together, formed a complete and nuanced vocabulary. A plain weave where threads cross over and under in a simple one-to-one pattern was the everyday speech of common cloth, sturdy and unadorned. Yet a shift in this pattern could transform the message entirely. A twill weave where the weft thread passes over two or more warp threads creating a diagonal rib was not merely a decorative choice. This technique produced a denser, more flexible, and more durable fabric. The most famous of these, the herringbone pattern with its sharp, broken zigzags, was a subtle but powerful statement. When found in the tunics of soldiers and men-at-arms, the pattern did more than just resist wear. It visually echoed the fortified walls of a castle or the unyielding strength of chainmail, broadcasting an unspoken message of resilience and martial readiness to anyone who knew how to look. At the other end of the social spectrum, the most complex weaves were proclamations of power. Fabrics like damask and brocade, often shimmering with silk and threads of precious metal, were the equivalent of a royal decree. Their elaborate floral or geometric patterns, reversible and woven directly into the cloth on incredibly complex looms, were a technological marvel. To wear such a fabric was to announce that you possessed not just wealth, but the means to access distant, mysterious trade routes stretching to Byzantium and beyond. It was a walking map of your influence. Conversely, religious orders used weave as a code of denial. The rough, undecorated wool of a monk's habit, woven in the simplest manner possible, was a deliberate text of humility and poverty, its very plainness speaking volumes about the wearer's spiritual priorities. So before a single splash of color was added, the canvas itself was already speaking, telling a story of profession, status, and aspiration through the silent, intricate language of the loom. Yet this silent language of weave and texture was utterly transformed by its most powerful element, color. In the medieval world, color was not just decoration, it was a blazing declaration, a spectrum of secrets governed by rarity, cost, and profound symbolic meaning. To wear a specific hue was to broadcast a message as clear as any shouted proclamation. Consider the vivid crimson of a high-ranking cardinal's robes. This was not a simple red. It was a color painstakingly extracted from the crushed bodies of thousands of tiny kermes insects, a process so labor-intensive that the dye was worth its weight in gold. The resulting scarlet was a double-coded message, symbolizing both the sacred blood of Christ and the immense worldly authority of the church official who could afford to wear it. At the very pinnacle of this chromatic hierarchy sat Tyrian purple. This deep, rich purple was produced from the mucous glands of a specific Mediterranean sea snail, with thousands of snails needed to dye the trim of a single garment. For centuries, Roman and Byzantine emperors enforced sumptuary laws that reserved this color exclusively for imperial use. To see a figure clad in purple was to see walking, breathing imperial power, a code so strong it needed no words. For the vast majority of people, however, the color palette was drawn from the earth itself. Peasants and commoners wore colors derived from readily available plants like woad for a dull blue or madder root for a rusty red. Their clothing spoke in muted tones of brown, gray, and beige, a visual testament to their social station and limited means. Beyond social rank, colors carried deep emotional and religious weight. White was the color of purity and innocence, often worn for baptisms and by young unmarried women. Black became the formal color of mourning and solemnity, while green symbolized the restless energy of love, nature, and vitality. Every choice of dye was therefore a deliberate act of coding, a public statement understood by all. And onto these brilliantly colored canvases, weavers and embroiderers would add the most explicit layer of all, the intricate symbols that turned fabric into an open book. The threads of weave and color were only the beginning of the story. With the skill of a scribe illuminating a manuscript, the medieval needleworker could transform a garment into a vibrant, speaking canvas. Embroidery elevated clothing from a coded fabric to a portable chronicle of identity and allegiance. This was storytelling in silk and gold thread, a deliberate and painstaking art form where every stitch carried weight. The most famous example, the Bayeux Tapestry, is a monumental embroidery that stretches for over 200 feet, narrating the Norman conquest of England with a clarity and drama that rivals any written history. It demonstrates the power of the needle to record epic events for all to see. On a more personal scale, heraldry was the most direct form of stitched communication. A knight riding into battle or attending a tournament was a moving billboard. His surcoat, a long tunic worn over his armor, would be emblazoned with his unique coat of arms. 3 golden lions on a red field instantly identified him as a knight in the service of the English king. This was not mere decoration. It was a vital identifier in the chaotic melee of combat and a public declaration of feudal loyalty. His entire identity, his lineage, and his sworn allegiance were broadcast through these embroidered symbols. This language of the needle extended far beyond the nobility. In bustling medieval towns, members of craft guilds used embroidery to proclaim their profession and pride. A master baker might have a sheaf of wheat stitched onto his apron. A carpenter could wear a tunic embroidered with a hammer and chisel. These were not just uniforms, they were badges of honor, signaling membership in a powerful and respected community. They turned everyday workwear into a statement of skill and belonging. Because embroidery was a slow, expensive process, each chosen symbol was a conscious investment, a permanent part of the garment's secret message. And often, these stitched stories incorporated patterns that held even deeper, sometimes mystical, significance. The repetitive knots and interlaces found on cuffs and collars were not just for beauty, they were believed to offer protection, weaving a spell of safety directly into the fabric of life itself. These intricate patterns were far more than just pleasing to the eye. They formed a hidden geometry of belief, a silent code of knots and networks woven directly into the fabric. In the Celtic and Norse worlds, interlacing knots that snaked across borders and cuffs were not random designs. They were profound symbols of eternity, their endless, unbroken lines representing the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. To wear a garment edged with such a pattern was not merely a fashion choice, it was an act of spiritual protection. People believed these complex weaves could trap malevolent spirits or weave a shield of safety around the wearer, turning a simple cloak into a talisman. This sacred geometry was a global language. Through trade and cultural exchange, Islamic artistic traditions introduced breathtaking arabesques and perfect geometric tessellations into European courts. These patterns, which covered surfaces with interlocking stars and polygons, were a deliberate reflection of a worldview. They symbolized the infinite, unending nature of God, a universe without beginning or end, captured in the precise repetition of a single, perfect shape. Creating these patterns required the weaver to become a mathematician, a geometer of the divine, calculating angles and repeats with meticulous care. For those who understood the symbolism, a specific pattern could act as a subtle signal, a quiet nod of recognition indicating shared philosophical beliefs or membership in a specific cultural group. This silent language of lines and shapes connected the individual wearer to the vast, orderly cosmos, making a piece of cloth a map of the universe. And this symbolic language found its most potent and personal expression not in the main garment, but in the smaller, more intimate items that completed an outfit. While the main garment spoke in full sentences of weave and color, the accessories provided the crucial punctuation. A finely tooled leather belt was far more than a way to hold up your hose. Its ornate metal buckle could be the exclamation point of your entire identity. For a knight, the act of being girded with a sword belt was a central part of the ceremony of knighthood itself, transforming the accessory into a symbol of his sworn duty. In the civic sphere, a heavy, intricately decorated belt and a matching purse were the unmistakable badges of a mayor or a high-ranking town official, signaling authority to everyone in the marketplace. The materials of these everyday objects were a clear and immediate shorthand for status. A buckle made of silver gilt, shimmering with a gold-like finish, announced immense wealth, while a simple, functional iron clasp spoke of a modest, practical life. The purses that hung from these belts, often called alms bags, were tiny canvases for personal expression, embroidered with scenes of courtly lovers or parables from the Bible. They offered a quiet glimpse into the wearer's private devotions or romantic hopes, a small, portable diary of the heart. Jewelry amplified this personal coding. A brooch holding a cloak closed was not merely a fastener, it was often a protective amulet. Gemstones like sapphires were believed to ward off poison, while emeralds were thought to improve eyesight. The placement of a ring was equally significant. A ring worn on the thumb might be a simple sign of wealth, but a ring on the little finger could denote membership in a discreet guild or even a secret society, a silent handshake made visible to those in the know. Even the most humble traveler participated in this language. A pilgrim who had journeyed to a distant shrine like Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela would sew a cheap, mass-produced lead badge onto their hat or cloak. This simple token was a powerful code, broadcasting their piety and their worldly experience to all they met. These accessories refined and clarified the primary message of the clothing, adding layers of nuance. But sometimes the most vital messages were not meant for public display at all. They were secrets stitched into the lining, hidden from all but the wearer. But the most intimate conversations were often hidden in plain sight, stitched into the inner layers no one else could see. Within the secret folds of a lining or the concealed strength of a seam, clothing held its most personal and potent messages. For a noblewoman, her lavish gown was a public performance of status, but its inner lining could be a private chapel. She might have a tiny, cloth-wrapped relic of a saint or a carefully inscribed prayer scroll secretly stitched into the hem. This was not for show, it was a deeply personal source of divine comfort and protection, a whispered secret between her and her God, known only to her and the most trusted servant who helped her dress each day. For the crusader marching toward an uncertain fate, the cross emblazoned on his surcoat was a public declaration, but a second, simpler cross sewn onto the inside of his tunic, against his heart, was a private vow. It was a constant, tactile reminder of his sacred oath, a promise made to himself that he would carry all the way to Jerusalem. This practice of concealment was not limited to the spiritual. The very stitches that held a garment together could be a covert signal. A tailor belonging to a persecuted religious group or a discreet merchant guild might use a specific, unconventional seam technique, a hidden herringbone or an unusual backstitch, known only to initiates. To the outside world, the doublet was simply well made, but to another member of the group, that subtle detail in the construction was a silent handshake, a quiet message of recognition and trust that offered safety in a dangerous world. These hidden elements transformed clothing from a public billboard into a personal talisman or a secret badge of identity. This sophisticated use of concealment finds its ultimate expression in the most guarded institutions of the medieval world, the craft guilds, where the secrets of the loom were protected as fiercely as any state secret. The secrets of the loom were guarded with the ferocity of state secrets. Within the walled cities of medieval Europe, the true masters of textile codes were not kings or queens, but the powerful craft guilds. These organizations were far more than simple trade unions. They were fraternities bound by solemn oaths, complex rituals, and a fierce sense of shared identity. And nothing made this identity more visible than the clothes their members were required to wear. From the moment a boy entered a workshop as an apprentice, his clothing began to tell the story of his journey. An apprentice would wear a simple, often plain tunic, a visual code that signaled his lowly, learning status to every master and customer in the town. Once he proved his skill and became a journeyman, the code on his back would change. He might be permitted to wear a specific style of hat or a distinctively cut coat, marking him as a qualified craftsman free to seek work wherever his guild had influence. The ultimate sartorial achievement was the master's robe. This was not just a garment, it was a certificate of excellence, a walking diploma that announced to the world that this individual had created a masterpiece judged worthy by his peers. The very apron of a blacksmith, stiff with use, or the precise cut of a tailor's own coat, was a uniform that communicated his exact skill level and professional standing without a single word being spoken. This coding reached its peak during civic processions and guild meetings. On these important occasions, members would don their full ceremonial livery, robes in the guild's official colors and embroidered with its specific symbols. Imagine the spectacle of a city street filled with bakers in deep blue cloaks bearing a golden sheaf of wheat, or fishmongers in silver-gray tunics marked with a leaping salmon. This created a powerful visual language of solidarity and exclusivity, a moving tapestry that mapped the city's entire economic and social structure right before your eyes. For some guilds, the codes woven into their garments held even deeper meanings. The masons who built the great cathedrals worked with sacred geometry every day. The intricate geometric patterns embroidered on their ceremonial aprons were not merely decorative. They were believed to reflect the divine proportions of the universe itself, a secret knowledge encoded in thread, visible to all but understood only by the initiated. To wear the guild's livery was therefore a mandatory act, a public vow that bound the individual to the collective and signaled his trade to the entire community. This rigid, corporate coding of the merchant and artisan classes stood in complete opposition to the fluid, sumptuous, and highly personal fashion statements of the aristocracy, creating a silent tension in the streets of every medieval city. This silent language of clothing was so potent that it demanded official regulation. Across Europe, kings, parliaments, and town councils enacted strict sumptuary laws, a web of rules designed to control the very fabric of society. These were not mere suggestions but legally enforced decrees that dictated exactly who could wear what. A law in England might explicitly forbid a wealthy merchant or his wife from wearing sable fur or luxurious velvet, materials decreed to be the exclusive right of the nobility. In France, regulations might limit the length of the exaggerated shoe tips known as poulaines, ensuring a commoner's footwear could never rival the extravagant silhouettes of a duke. The goal was starkly clear: to prevent the rising merchant class from using their new wealth to dress like their social superiors. These laws were an attempt to freeze the social hierarchy in place, to ensure that a person's rank was instantly legible from 100 paces away. The very existence of these regulations reveals a deep-seated anxiety among the ruling classes. They recognized that clothing was not just a reflection of status but a tool to acquire it. A merchant's wife in a silk gown was not just wearing a dress, she was making a bold political statement about her family's power and influence, challenging the established order without saying a word. Yet the fact that these laws were constantly reissued with ever more specific and frustrated language tells another story, one of widespread defiance. People repeatedly found clever ways to skirt the rules, using linings of forbidden fabric or adding illicit trims that could be hidden or removed. This ongoing battle between legislated dress and personal aspiration shows that the medieval street was a fashion runway where social climbing and social control were in constant, silent conflict. And while secular powers tried to regulate the body, the Church sought to clothe the soul, developing a sartorial theology that was every bit as complex. The Church wove its theology directly into the cloth of its vestments, creating a divine wardrobe where every thread preached a sermon. No earthly king's court could rival the intricate symbolism encoded in the garments worn by the clergy. For the medieval believer, these were not mere costumes. They were sacred uniforms that transformed the priest into a living icon during the Mass, a walking embodiment of faith itself. The ceremony began with the alb, a simple, ankle-length tunic of pure white linen. Its stark whiteness was a powerful visual code for the purity of soul required to stand at the altar, a reminder of the baptismal garment and a life cleansed from sin. Over this went the stole, a long, narrow strip of fabric whose placement signaled the priest's authority, and finally the chasuble, the ornate, often heavily embroidered outer cloak. The chasuble's shape, a seamless circle of fabric with a hole for the head, was itself a symbol. It represented the yoke of Christ, the weight of spiritual responsibility borne by the priest for his congregation. But the most dynamic element of this coded language was color. The church organized the year into a liturgical calendar, and the vestments changed hue to reflect its spiritual seasons. The congregation did not need to hear the date announced, they could see it. White or gold vestments blazed with the joy of Christmas and Easter feasts. The deep, solemn purple of Advent and Lent spoke of penance and anticipation. The fiery red worn on the feasts of martyrs recalled the Holy Spirit's descent at Pentecost and the blood spilled for the faith. This chromatic code allowed even the illiterate to participate fully in the rhythm of the sacred year, reading the story of salvation in the colors draped over their priest. The materials themselves whispered of higher truths. Linen, woven from the flax that springs from the earth, was associated with righteousness and purity. Silk, with its heavenly sheen, represented the glory of the saints and the splendor of paradise. A bishop's raiment took this coding to another level. His ring was not just jewelry, it was a seal of his apostolic authority and his symbolic marriage to the church. The specific shade of violet he was permitted to wear set him visually apart within the hierarchy, a clear, silent signal of his rank that everyone from a cardinal to a common farmer could instantly understand. This entire system was designed to make the intangible tangible, to clothe complex spiritual concepts in a form that could be seen and felt. And this idea that clothing could express deep, even transcendent emotions was not confined to the cathedral. It flowed directly into the most personal of human experiences, the pursuit of love, where a knight might wear his lady's colors into a tournament, turning his sleeve into a silent, public vow of devotion. A knight riding into the tournament lists was a canvas of public expectation, but the most important message he carried was often a small, intimate one. Tied to his helmet or wound around his arm was a lady's sleeve, a scarf, or a simple ribbon. In the coded theater of courtly love, this textile token was a profound declaration. This favor was far more than a good luck charm. It was a non-verbal contract between the lady and her champion. By accepting it, the knight pledged to fight for her honor, and by bestowing it, she granted him her public esteem, making her personal affection a part of his public identity. The fabric itself whispered secrets only the two of them could fully decipher. A favor of deep green silk might signal growing hope or fertile affection, while one embroidered with a single, steadfast oak tree in brown thread could be a private code for unwavering strength. The incorporation of a gold thread, painstakingly stitched along the edge, might be their silent vow of loyalty. The public nature of this act was electrifying. For the lady, it was a carefully calculated risk, a way to express personal choice and influence within a society that often denied her both. For the knight, displaying the favor transformed the chaotic violence of the joust into a performance dedicated to a single, idealized audience. His victories became her glory, his courage a reflection of her worth. These delicate textiles, these scraps of silk and ribbon, were thereby elevated into the most potent symbols, weaving the most intimate of human emotions directly into the very public spectacle of chivalry. This personal use of fabric as a language extended naturally from the tournament field to the most significant moments of a person's life, where textiles marked every transition from birth to death. A newborn's first experience of the world was the tight, protective wrap of a blessed swaddling cloth. This was not just a practical measure, but a spiritual one, coding the infant for divine protection from the very first breath. The fabric itself, often linen for its purity, was sometimes anointed with holy water or had a tiny cross stitched into a hidden corner, a parent's silent prayer for safety woven directly into the child's first garment. This act set the pattern for a lifetime where every major transition was marked and guided by symbolic dress. Marriage was perhaps the most public display of this coding. A bride's attire was a complex document of alliance. While the vibrant reds and rich golds of romance might appear in literature, in practice, deep blue was a powerfully popular choice for those who could afford it. This hue, strongly associated with the purity and fidelity of the Virgin Mary, coded the bride as a virtuous partner in a sacred union, yet the message was equally earthly. Her gown would be embroidered with the heraldic symbols of her own family, and often those of her new husband's house, turning her into a living treaty. Every stitch declared that this was a merger of lands, wealth, and political influence, a walking contract witnessed by the entire community. The final transition, death, demanded a garment that spoke not to the living world but to the divine. The wealthy were often buried in their finest attire, a final assertion of the status they held in life, a rich velvet gown or a fur-trimmed cloak serving as their testament to posterity. For others, the choice was a simple linen shroud, perhaps even one provided by their religious guild, its plainness a coded statement of humility and a hope for salvation unburdened by worldly pride. The presence or absence of embroidery, the quality of the cloth, even the color of the shroud, communicated the family's standing and their deepest beliefs about the journey to the afterlife. These rites of passage wove the textile code into the very fabric of human existence, marking each profound change with a garment meant to be read by both society and God. Yet the meaning of a blue gown or a specific stitch was not universal. A symbol of purity in one region could carry a completely different connotation just a few hundred miles away, a reminder that this silent language had many distinct and fascinating dialects. A deep crimson gown in London might signal the wearer's connection to royal favor, while that same vibrant red in Constantinople could mean the wearer was the emperor's wife, on pain of death for anyone else to even imitate. The silent language of cloth was fractured into 1,000 regional dialects, each shaped by the unique pressures of local economy, climate, and power. In the damp, prosperous cities of Flanders, the code was written in wool. The quality of the cloth itself was the primary message. A merchant in Bruges or Ghent would be instantly judged by the fineness of his woolen cloak, its dense, smooth weave and rich color, often a deep blue from local woad vats, proclaiming his success and his membership in the powerful Weavers' Guild. This was a language of urban capitalism, where commercial wealth was woven into the very fiber of one's public identity. Travel south to the sun-drenched Italian peninsula, and the vocabulary shifted dramatically to silk and velvet. In republics like Venice and Florence, where merchant families rivaled kings in wealth, the textile code became a brazen tool of political one-upmanship. Sumptuary laws issued by nervous city councils were treated as mere suggestions. A Florentine banker's wife might wear a gown of velvet so heavy with gold thread it shimmered audibly as she walked, a deliberate and magnificent flouting of regulations meant to humble her class. Here, clothing was less about prescribed rank and more about a family's audacious assertion of its own power and taste. This fluid, competitive display stood in stark contrast to the frozen, hieratic language of the Byzantine Empire. In the court of Constantinople, the textile code was as rigid as law. Specific shades of purple, intricate pearl-encrusted patterns known as the Vestimenta Imperii were the exclusive legal property of the emperor and his immediate family. For anyone else to wear such a symbol was not just a social faux pas, it was an act of treason, a direct challenge to the divine order itself. The Byzantine system left no room for ambiguity, encoding imperial authority directly into the dye vat and the loom. Meanwhile, in the Nordic countries, the code was softer, woven with folk wisdom. A pattern like the Selby rose, an 8-petaled star embroidered on a woolen mitten, was not about imperial decree but about hearth and home. It was believed to bring protection and good fortune to the wearer, a charming and personal dialect in the vast conversation of medieval cloth. To accurately decode any garment, you must first ask where it was worn. The same symbol could whisper a prayer for safety in one land and shout a declaration of absolute power in another. This incredible diversity sets the stage for the most dynamic exchanges, where these distinct textile dialects met, clashed, and began to influence one another along the bustling trade routes of the medieval world. A dragon woven in Chinese silk could become an archangel in a European cathedral. The great trade routes like the Silk Road were not merely conduits for exotic fabrics. They were information superhighways, transmitting entire symbolic languages across continents. When a caravan arrived from the east, it carried more than bolts of silk and spices. It delivered a new vocabulary for the loom. Chinese silks, adorned with mythical creatures like the phoenix and the dragon, symbols of imperial power and cosmic balance in their homeland, entered markets from Venice to London. To European eyes, these exotic patterns were mysterious and potent. A dragon might be reinterpreted as a defeated serpent, a symbol of St. Michael's victory over evil. The phoenix, rising from its own ashes, could be read as a powerful allegory for the resurrection of Christ. This was not a loss of meaning but a creative translation, a weaving of Eastern symbols into the familiar tapestry of Western belief. Persian textiles, with their intricate scenes of royal hunters pursuing lions and gazelles, profoundly influenced European tapestry work. These images imported an entire Eastern lexicon of nobility, courage, and dominion over nature, which European aristocrats eagerly adopted to embellish their own castles and cloaks. The result was a garment that acted as a cultural palimpsest. A single piece of silk brocade worn by a duke in France might carry the technical genius of Chinese weavers, the artistic vision of Persian designers, and the heraldic pride of its European owner. He was not just coding his immense wealth, he was advertising his connection to a vast, sophisticated world beyond his own borders, presenting himself as a man of global tastes and influence. Yet this free flow of ideas also created opportunities for cunning deception. An unscrupulous merchant might sell a length of cloth woven with a pattern sacred to a distant culture, passing it off as merely a fashionable novelty to an ignorant buyer. A symbol meant to ward off evil spirits in one land could be worn as simple decoration in another, its protective power completely lost in translation. This global exchange of textile codes was therefore a double-edged sword, enriching the visual language of the medieval world while simultaneously blurring and sometimes erasing the original meanings stitched into the thread. But this sophisticated language of cloth could be twisted into a weapon of lies. The same codes that broadcasted identity could be deliberately manipulated to conceal it, turning the textile arts into a vital tool for espionage and survival. A spy moving through hostile territory would not carry obvious identification. Instead, a seemingly innocuous detail on their clothing became a covert signal. A messenger might wear a hood lined with a specific shade of green, a color known only to his contacts. To anyone else, he was just another traveler, but to the right pair of eyes, that flash of color was a silent, safe handshake. This deception worked on a grander scale, too. A rebel plotting to infiltrate a rival lord's castle would not arrive in his own colors. He would instead don the livery of his enemy, his cloak bearing the very heraldic symbols he sought to undermine. By mastering the local textile code, he could walk straight through the gates, his true intentions hidden behind a perfect disguise. For those fleeing danger, the code offered a path to anonymity. A nobleman hunted for treason could shed his silks and velvets, replacing them with the coarse, undyed wool of a pilgrim. The humble robe and the traditional wide-brimmed hat were a universally understood costume of harmless piety, a cloak of invisibility that allowed a fugitive to melt into the stream of travelers on any well-trodden road. On the battlefield, this manipulation was a matter of life and death. A knight's surcoat proudly displaying his coat of arms made him an easy target for enemies seeking ransom or revenge. In the chaos of combat, it was not uncommon for knights to simply turn their surcoats inside out, concealing their heraldry beneath a plain, unmarked lining. This simple act transformed them from named, valuable individuals into anonymous, and therefore much safer, combatants. The most cunning uses of textile espionage involved sending messages in plain sight. A tapestry gifted from one court to another might appear to be a scene of mythological hunting, but woven into the border, disguised among the foliage, could be a pattern of knots or animals that spelled out a warning of an impending attack or the location of a traitor. A lady might send a seemingly innocent embroidered linen to an ally. The image of a falcon chasing a hare might be a standard decorative motif, but to the recipient, aware of the prearranged code, it could mean the king's hunters are closing in on the rebel camp. This subversive use of the textile code reveals its ultimate power. It was a language so fluid that its words could be used to tell the truth or to craft a perfect, devastating lie. The perception of these codes, whether honest or deceptive, relied entirely on a medieval understanding of vision itself, a belief that sight was not a passive act but an almost physical connection between the eye and the symbolic world. A king's golden crown was not just a piece of jewelry, it was the physical proof of his right to rule. This was the core of the medieval mindset, a world where every visible detail was believed to be a direct reflection of an invisible truth. Society was structured as a great chain of being, a divine hierarchy stretching from God and the angels down through kings, nobles, priests, and peasants to the animals and plants. In this worldview, everything and everyone had a preordained place. Clothing became the most immediate and powerful way to make this abstract order visible on the bustling, chaotic streets of a medieval town. A person's attire was not seen as a matter of personal taste, but as a necessary sign of their fixed position within God's cosmic plan. To dress above your station was not just a social faux pas, it was an act of rebellion against the divine order itself, a lie written on the body. This is why people were so skilled at reading the messages in cloth. They were not simply observing fashion, they were confirming the structure of their universe with every glance. When a nobleman wore velvet, he was performing his nobility, making his God-given authority tangible to everyone who saw him. The fabric did not just represent his status in the eyes of society, it helped to constitute it. This symbolic worldview infused materials with almost magical significance. Silk was not merely luxurious, its shimmering quality connected it to the light of heaven and the purity of saints. Linen, growing pure and white from the earth, was the obvious choice for baptismal garments and priestly albs, symbolizing a soul cleansed from sin. Even the humble, sturdy nature of wool reinforced the perceived solidity and reliability of the common people who wore it. This deep-seated belief that external appearance revealed internal essence is what made the textile code so potent and its violation so deeply threatening. To counterfeit the code was to tamper with reality itself. A child's simple woolen cap, embroidered with a row of tiny red crosses along the brim, was much more than a warm hat. It was a mother's whispered prayer made visible, a shield stitched in thread against the unseen dangers of a world filled with sickness and malevolent spirits. This belief in the inherent power of cloth transformed ordinary textiles into extraordinary objects, blurring the line between the material and the spiritual. The most sacred relics of the Church, a sliver of the true cross or the bone of a martyr, were not simply stored in chests. They were lovingly wrapped in layers of the finest silk and linen, for it was believed that the precious fabric could somehow contain and even amplify the holiness within, much like a jeweled setting enhances the brilliance of a gem. This logic extended to the garments of saints themselves. A tunic once worn by a holy man or woman became a relic of immense power, believed to cure fevers or heal wounds through mere contact. People would travel for miles to touch a scrap of this cloth, absorbing a fraction of its perceived divine energy. The power was not always passive. Certain patterns were actively woven or embroidered into fabric as apotropaic devices designed to deflect harm. The cross was the most potent symbol, but intricate knotwork whose endless, unbroken lines were thought to confuse and trap evil spirits was equally common on collars and cuffs. For a knight riding to war, the secret message in his clothing was a direct invocation for survival. A prayer or a psalm might be carefully stitched by a loved one into the lining of his tunic, right over his heart, or woven directly into the fabric of his banner, turning the flag that led him into battle into a sacred talisman. Even everyday clothing could be a repository of hidden power. Small cloth amulets containing a written prayer, a blessed herb, or a root were secretly sewn into the hems of cloaks or the seams of doublets. In this context, the thread itself was not just a carrier of a secret message. It was a literal lifeline to the divine, a physical conduit for protection and healing. This profound belief that a woven pattern or a hidden stitch could alter fate provides the essential key to understanding history's most debated and enigmatic piece of cloth, the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin represents the ultimate expression of a coded textile, pushing the concept of a woven message to its absolute limit. Unlike a heraldic symbol or a hidden stitch, the image on the shroud is not a human-made design but a mysterious, full-body imprint, a negative photograph burned or stained into the linen fibers. For millions of believers, this is not a code to be cracked but a divine revelation, a silent witness to a moment of supreme sacrifice. The cloth itself, a simple herringbone weave of linen, is the same material used for priestly albs and burial shrouds across the medieval world, a canvas of purity and mortality. Yet it claims to carry a message far beyond any heraldic boast or guild secret, a message written not in dye but in what some see as the very energy of resurrection. This idea of an image transferred directly onto cloth was deeply compelling to the medieval mind. It resonated with other revered objects like the veil of Veronica, said to bear the miraculous image of Christ's face. Whether the shroud is a genuine relic or an astonishingly ingenious artifact from the 13th or 14th century, its very existence speaks volumes about the era's obsession with clothing as a vessel for the sacred. It combines every thread of our exploration, a linen base, the status of a pilgrimage relic, and an image that has been subjected to every form of modern decoding from carbon dating to spectral analysis. The shroud demonstrates that the ultimate ambition of the medieval textile code was not merely to signal status, but to capture truth itself, to freeze a moment of profound transformation into the very threads of a simple cloth. While the shroud is a singular, enigmatic case, the desire to use fabric as a durable record was a driving force behind one of the most beautiful and informative art forms of the age, the narrative tapestry. A king's velvet robe spoke with a thunderous voice, but the true power of the textile code lay in the quiet conversations it enabled among the common folk. How deeply did the average farmer, merchant, or housewife truly understand this complex language? The answer is that they were remarkably fluent in its essential grammar. A peasant toiling in the fields might not decipher the intricate rules of heraldic quartering on a visiting baron's shield, but they knew without a doubt that the deep purple trim on his cloak was forbidden to them, a color reserved for a power so distant it was almost mythical. They recognized the shimmer of silk from 100 paces away as a definitive sign of wealth that could buy their entire village. They could read the scallop shell on a traveler's hat and understand it meant a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, a journey of faith they could only dream of. This was not an elite knowledge, it was a necessary survival skill. Navigating the crowded market square or making way for a procession required an instant, instinctual reading of the social landscape through clothing. Was that approaching figure a tax collector, a guild master, or a simple journeyman? The cut of their tunic, the quality of their wool, and the presence or absence of a silver badge provided the immediate answer. This shared public literacy created a predictable social rhythm. It told the blacksmith how deeply to bow and the baker what price to ask. It reinforced a sense of order, a visual map of the great chain of being that everyone could follow. Yet this very fluency also made the code a weapon for disruption. When a wealthy merchant's wife dared to wear a fur collar reserved for the nobility, the gasp in the street was not just about envy. It was a recognition that the established order was being challenged, a silent, defiant act that every onlooker could understand. This universal grasp of the basic vocabulary, from the blazingly obvious crown to the subtle stitch on a guildsman's sleeve, is what made medieval society tick. It was a language everyone spoke, ensuring that every thread, from the humblest to the most luxurious, carried a message that would be heard. The rigid cosmic order stitched into medieval clothing could not hold forever. A new wind was blowing from the Italian city-states, a spirit of humanism and rediscovered classical ideals that began to prize the individual over the collective. The great chain of being, that divine hierarchy which clothing was meant to mirror, started to look less like an unbreakable law and more like a set of old chains waiting to be shrugged off. Primary agents of this change were not kings or knights, but bankers and merchants. A newly wealthy Florentine cloth trader, enriched by trade routes his grandfather could never have imagined, felt little obligation to dress like a humble burgher. He commissioned portraits of himself and his family in the richest velvets and furs, not to signal a fixed place in a feudal structure, but to celebrate his own ambition, his own taste, his own hard-won success. This was the birth of a new kind of power, and it was woven from gold thread. Sumptuary laws, those desperate attempts to legislate dress, became a laughingstock. They were reissued with frantic frequency, each new version more detailed and exasperated than the last, a clear sign that the authorities were fighting a losing battle. How could a law in London stop a merchant's wife from ordering a bolt of forbidden crimson silk through a network of Venetian contacts? The old codes of legibility were breaking down. You could no longer assume that the man in the finest gown was a nobleman by birth. He might simply be a very clever businessman. Fashion ceased to be a universal language and splintered into 1,000 personal dialects. The message was no longer just who you were born to be, but who you claimed to be and how much you were willing to spend to prove it. This shift is visible in the art of the period. Compare the formal, symbolic robes in a medieval illuminated manuscript to the confident, individualized attire in a painting by Jan van Eyck. The clothing in a Van Eyck portrait is still coded, but the symbols are more personal, more about displaying worldly knowledge and exquisite taste than announcing a feudal rank. The focus turns inward to the individual wearing the cloth. Yet, if you know where to look, the ghost of the medieval code never truly left us. The academic robe you see at a university graduation is a direct descendant of the medieval scholar's gown, its cut and colors silently signaling the wearer's field of study and level of achievement. The military uniform, with its stripes, medals, and specific colors, is a modern heraldic system designed for instant recognition of rank and regiment. Even the simple business suit operates as a code of professionalism and neutrality, a uniform for a different kind of battlefield. We still read clothing every single day. We have just forgotten how fluent we really are. That ribbon pinned to a lapel is a quiet echo of a medieval knight's favor. The textile code never truly vanished, it simply evolved, its threads rewoven into the very fabric of our modern lives. We may not wear heraldic surcoats, but we are surrounded by uniforms that serve the same purpose of instant identification. A police officer's badge and blue uniform are a clear, public declaration of authority, just as a judge's black robe communicates impartiality and the weight of the law, a direct descendant of the solemnity encoded in clerical vestments. The caps and gowns at a university graduation are a perfect example of this living legacy. The specific colors of the hoods and trim are not arbitrary. They are a sophisticated system silently announcing the graduate's field of study and academic degree, a modern form of heraldry for the world of learning. Even in our most casual wardrobes, the coding continues. High-fashion designers frequently raid the past, using historical symbolism to add layers of meaning to their creations. A collection might feature armor-like silhouettes that evoke medieval knights, or intricate embroidery that references sacred geometry, translating ancient codes into contemporary luxury. More organically, subcultures create their own powerful textile languages. The leather jacket of a rocker, the specific plaid of a skateboarder, or the minimalist aesthetic of a tech professional all function as badges of membership, signaling shared values and identity to those in the know, much like a medieval guildsman's livery. Perhaps the most poignant modern parallel is the awareness ribbon. A small piece of colored fabric worn on a chest becomes a global symbol of solidarity, hope, and support for a cause. This is the direct spiritual successor to the medieval pilgrim's badge, a simple token that broadcasts a deeply personal commitment to the wider world. We live in a world of unprecedented sartorial choice, a democracy of dress that would have bewildered a medieval tailor. Yet with this freedom comes a new responsibility. Every day we make conscious choices about what to wear, coding ourselves for a job interview, a first date, or a protest march. We understand instinctively that a sharp business suit projects competence, while comfortable athleisure wear signals a more relaxed, informal persona. The silent conversation is still happening all around us, in every boardroom, classroom, and city street. By understanding the deep history of this language, we become more fluent decoders not only of the past but of the present, learning to read the subtle messages stitched into the world we walk through every day. Deciphering the silent language of a medieval sleeve or a forgotten stitch requires the skills of a master detective. Historians begin with the objects themselves, the few precious garments that have survived the centuries, often preserved in the cool, dark silence of a cathedral treasury or a noble family's chest. A single, threadbare tunic becomes a primary source, its very fabric holding clues invisible to the casual observer. Under magnification, the weave pattern tells a story of the loom that created it. The type of stitch used in a seam can hint at the regional background of the tailor. Scientists can now perform non-invasive dye analysis, identifying the specific plants or insects used to create a color, which immediately reveals the garment's cost and the social standing of its original owner. But physical evidence is only one piece of the puzzle. To understand how these clothes moved and what they meant, scholars turn to the art of the period. The vibrant pages of illuminated manuscripts and the detailed panels of altarpieces are more than beautiful art, they are frozen moments in time. A historian will scrutinize the drape of a gown in a painting of a royal wedding, or the precise way a knight's surcoat hangs over his armor in a stained glass window, searching for details of construction and context that the artifact alone cannot provide. These visual records show us the clothing in action, worn by living, breathing individuals in specific social and ceremonial settings. The final layer of understanding comes from the written word. A dry list of wardrobe accounts from a king's court reveals exactly how much was paid for a bolt of silk or the labor of an embroiderer, giving us a stark economic reality behind the splendor. The frustrated, repetitive text of sumptuary laws shows us which sartorial statements the powerful found most threatening, and poetry or personal letters can offer a glimpse into the emotional weight a particular color or token held for the people of the time. By weaving together these three distinct threads, the material, the visual, and the textual, historians can slowly reconstruct the complete sentence, transforming a silent artifact in a museum case back into a speaking witness. This painstaking work ensures that our understanding of history is not a cold collection of dates and treaties, but a vibrant tapestry of human aspiration, belief, and identity, one where every thread has a story to tell. Even with all our modern tools, the full vocabulary of the medieval loom remains just beyond our grasp. We can decode the language of kings, but the quiet dialects of the common folk are often lost to time. What precise hopes or fears were woven into the repeating patterns on a peasant woman's apron? Were the intricate knots stitched into a child's bonnet a simple decoration, or a mother's specific prayer for protection against a fever that swept through the village? The suppression of groups like the Cathars may have silenced their voices, but did it also erase a unique textile language, a secret code of stitches or colors used to recognize fellow believers under the watchful eyes of the Inquisition? We may never know. The very nature of cloth is its fragility. The grand silk gowns preserved in cathedral treasuries are the exception, the loud, permanent proclamations of the powerful. The millions of garments worn by ordinary people, the wool tunics and linen shifts that formed the true fabric of daily life, have almost all returned to dust. This creates a historical record that is profoundly skewed, forcing us to listen mostly to the shouts of the elite, while the whispers of the masses have faded into silence. This is why every new archaeological discovery feels like finding a missing page from a great historical novel. The waterlogged remains of the Merry Rose warship, for instance, yielded not just the fine gloves of an archer but the very texture of his world, allowing us to touch the wool that common sailors wore. Similarly, the accidental preservation of a body in a peat bog can offer a miraculous snapshot, revealing the weave of a humble cloak and the subtle stains of use that no painting can capture. Each of these fragile remnants has the power to overturn our assumptions, to introduce a new word or a forgotten symbol into our dictionary. The study of these textile codes is therefore a conversation that is never truly finished. It is a dialogue with the past where every new thread pulled can lead to a revelation, reminding us that history is not a sealed archive but a living, breathing tapestry, still slowly unfolding before our eyes. We began by imagining a world where clothes could speak, and we have discovered that for medieval people they truly did. A simple tunic was never just a tunic, it was a complex document, its every thread a potential letter in a vast, silent alphabet. This was a language that could declare a rebellion with a splash of crimson dye, or whisper a prayer for safety with a hidden stitch. It was a system that reinforced the very architecture of society, from the cosmic order of the great chain of being to the daily realities of the marketplace. Yet it was also a tool of profound personal expression, carrying the intimate hopes of a lover's token and the sacred weight of a saint's relic. By learning to read this language, we do more than just understand old clothes. We gain a profound new window into the medieval mind. We begin to see their world not as a distant, monochrome past, but as a vibrant, complex society pulsing with color and meaning, where every choice of fabric and pattern was a conscious act of communication. The next time you stand before a medieval painting in a museum or gaze at a relic preserved behind glass, I encourage you to look closer. Lean in and study the drape of a velvet gown, the intricate border of an embroidered sleeve. See the colors, the patterns, the stitches. Remember that you are not just looking at cloth, you are looking at a secret message, a personal story waiting patiently to be decoded. The specific vocabulary may have faded, but with careful study and a curious eye, we can still hear its whispers across the centuries, reminding us of the timeless human desire